The barrel of the rifle felt like an extension of her own arm, cold and unyielding. It pressed hard against the sweat-slicked temple of the man kneeling in the dirt, his eyes wide with a terror he had, until moments ago, believed only he could inspire. The scent of hay, horse sweat, and fresh blood was thick in the barn air. Clara's voice was not a whisper, not a scream, but a low, venomous hiss that cut through the silence. "Where is he?" The man's Adam's apple bobbed. "Lady, you're making a mistake." "Where is Silas?" she repeated, jamming the rifle harder. The world had narrowed to this single point. The man's fear, the weight of the gun, and the roaring fire in her chest that had finally burned away the ghost of the woman she used to be. She wasn't a widow anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was a reckoning. And before this night was over, they would all know her name. But how had she come to this? Just days ago, she was crouched by an empty hearth, waiting only for death. It all began with a knock on the door. Part 1. A devil's bargain. The wind was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at the bones of the small cabin. It shrieked through the cracks in the walls, a constant reminder of the emptiness that now surrounded Clara Evans. The hearth was cold, the cupboards bare. They had taken everything. When her husband Thomas's heart had given out, the settlers, men they'd called neighbors, descended like vultures. They buried him without a prayer, their faces hard and impatient. "He owed us," one had slurred, his breath thick with whiskey and rot. They stripped the cabin of its last sack of flour, its last side of bacon, its last flicker of hope, and left her with a shovel and a sneer. Clara had sat on the floorboards, staring at the dark stain where Thomas's life had seeped into the wood. She hadn't cried. Tears were a luxury, and she owned nothing. The grief was a hollow, frozen thing inside her, too vast to be thawed by something as simple as weeping. Night fell like a burial shroud, and the silence that followed was louder than the wind. It was a crushing weight, filled with the ghosts of broken promises. "Forever," Thomas had whispered at the altar. "Trust me, we'll make it through this winter," he'd promised by the fire. Now, all she had was the silence and the cold. That's when the first knock came. Sharp, authoritative. Her breath hitched. No one came this way unless they meant to take what little was left, perhaps the very breath in her lungs. Her fingers, trembling but determined, found the cold steel of the hunting knife Thomas had left under their bed. She crept to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Who's there?" Her voice was a cracked, fragile thing. "You going to let a man freeze to death out here?" The voice was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder. It was smooth as whiskey, but held none of the drunken slurring of the settlers. It was a voice of command. Hesitantly, she unlatched the door and cracked it open. The man who stood on her porch seemed to block out the storm itself. He was immense, broad-shouldered, with a hat tipped low over a mane of unruly dark hair. When he looked up, his eyes were the color of wet earth after a storm, dark, deep, and unreadable. He smelled of horse, smoke, leather, and a raw, masculine scent that was both intimidating and strangely grounding. "What do you want?" she whispered, the knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. His gaze swept over her, taking in the torn dress, the hollows of her cheeks, the fierce, terrified defiance in her eyes. "Ain't what I want," he said, his voice a low growl. "It's what you need." Before she could protest, he moved inside, his presence filling the tiny cabin, making it feel even smaller. In his arms was a large burlap sack. He set it on her empty table, and the scent of coffee, dried meat, and freshly baked bread hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so fierce it was painful. "Who sent you?" she asked, her grip on the knife tightening. "Ain't nobody." He shrugged off his heavy duster, revealing a powerful frame. Name's Silas Boon. Got a ranch 3 miles west. Saw those men ride off with a wagon full of what wasn't theirs. Why do you care? The words were sharp, a shield against the hope that was threatening to crack her frozen heart. Don't, he said, his gaze direct and unflinching. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But I know what it looks like when a man gets buried, and the woman he left behind gets buried right after. He looked at the bare cupboards, the cold hearth. I don't need charity, she spat, the words tasting like ash. Good. He leaned against the wall, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. He looked like a mountain, immovable and ancient. 'Cause this ain't charity, it's an offer. Offer? I need a cook, a hand with the horses, someone to keep the house from falling to pieces. You need a roof, food, a chance to see the spring. He paused, and his dark eyes seemed to pierce right through her, pinning her to the spot. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. And a man like me could use a wife. The word hung between them, heavy and obscene. Wife. The room tilted. Her grip on the knife was so tight, her knuckles were white. You think I'm just going to marry a stranger to survive? Silas's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His eyes were dark, a tempest of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. I ain't asking you to love me, Clara Evans. I ain't even asking you to like me. He took a step closer, and the space between them crackled. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the storm on his clothes. I'm asking you to stay alive, and in this world, that sometimes requires a devil's bargain. The wind howled, rattling the cabin as if trying to tear it apart. In the distance, a lone wolf answered its call. Marry a stranger or die alone. It wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum, delivered by a man who looked like he'd wrestled with devils of his own and won. She looked at the food on the table, then at the hard, unyielding face of Silas Boon. Her survival instinct, a raw and brutal thing, screamed at her. Yes, she heard herself say, the voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Part 2. The Haunting of Boon Ranch. Silas Boon's ranch house was as vast and silent as the man himself. It was a fortress of dark wood and stone, built to withstand the harshest winters and the most violent of men. But inside, it felt like a tomb. The fires roared in the hearths, but they offered little warmth against the chilling silence that permeated every room. For Clara, it was a gilded cage, a far cry from her tiny cabin, yet infinitely more lonely. Their days fell into a tense, unspoken rhythm. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended to the chickens. He worked from sunup to sundown, his presence a constant brooding weight at the edge of her awareness. They ate their meals in silence, the only sounds the clatter of silverware against tin plates and the crackling of the fire. His eyes would be on her, an intense, searching gaze that made her skin prickle. It wasn't lustful, not in a simple way. It was more complex, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle, to see the pieces of the woman she was beneath the shattered shell of the widow. This new proximity was a torment. Sometimes, while she worked in the kitchen, he would enter, his large frame filling the doorway. He wouldn't speak, just watch, and the air would become so thick with unspoken things she could barely breathe. She could smell the leather and winter air on him, a scent that was becoming dangerously familiar. She found herself acutely aware of the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his calloused hands, the way a muscle in his jaw would tick when he was lost in thought. It was an attraction born of intensity and shared desolation, and it terrified her. It felt like a betrayal to Thomas, a betrayal to the grief that had become her identity. One afternoon, while dusting the cavernous main room, she found a small, locked chest in a dark corner. It was the only object in the house that seemed personal, feminine. Her curiosity got the better of her. She found the key in a nearby drawer and opened it. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a silver locket and a pressed, withered rose. She opened the locket. A miniature portrait of a beautiful, smiling woman with eyes as bright as a summer sky stared back at her. Silas's first wife. The ghost that haunted this house. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara jumped, slamming the chest shut as if she'd been burned. Silas stood in the doorway, his face a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a fury that was cold and terrifying. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence overwhelming. I was just cleaning," she stammered, backing away. He didn't stop until he had her cornered against the wall, his body caging hers. He was so close she could feel the heat of his anger, see the storm in his eyes. He placed a hand on the wall next to her head, his arm a rigid bar. "You don't go through my things," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her heart hammering. But defiance, hot and sharp, rose with her fear. "You brought me here to be your wife. This is my house too, isn't it? Or am I just the maid?" His eyes darkened. "You know what this is. It's a roof. It's food. It's staying alive." "And what about her?" Clara shot back, nodding toward the chest. "Does her ghost get a say in this arrangement? Is that why this house feels like a mausoleum? Are you trying to bury me with her?" For a second, she saw something crack in his iron composure. A flicker of raw, unbearable pain. His jaw clenched, and his gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second. A silent, unwilling admission of the tension that sizzled between them. He wanted to touch her. The thought sent a jolt of combined fear and illicit thrill through her. "Leave it alone, Clara," he said, his voice ragged. He pushed himself away from the wall, the sudden absence of his heat leaving her feeling cold and exposed. He stalked out of the room, leaving her with a racing pulse and the ghost of a woman she would never know. That night, she dreamt of Thomas, but when he turned to kiss her, it was Silas's dark, haunted face she saw. Part 3. Screams in the night. The nightmares became a nightly ritual. Clara would thrash in the cold sheets, her cries echoing through the silent, cavernous house. She screamed for Thomas, begging him not to leave her, reliving his last moments, the cold indifference of the settlers. And every night, when she awoke, gasping and slick with sweat, Silas would be there. He wouldn't be in her bed, but standing in the doorway or sitting in the chair in the corner, a silent, brooding sentinel against the darkness. "Did you watch me all night?" she asked one morning, her voice raw, her pride stung by his constant vigilance. He was staring into the fire, a cup of coffee held in his large hands. "You were screaming his name again." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but she could feel the judgment in it. "You don't get to ask me about him," she snapped, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "I ain't asking." He turned his head, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I'm telling you, the dead don't answer back, Clara, and they sure as hell don't keep you warm at night." The cruelty of it, the raw truth of it, was a slap in the face. She threw the blanket off and stood, her nightgown doing little to shield her from the cold or his piercing gaze. "And you think you can? You think because you gave me a roof and a plate of beans that you can replace him?" He rose to his full, intimidating height, the firelight casting his face in harsh shadows. He moved toward her, a predator stalking its prey. "I don't want to replace him," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "I want you to forget him long enough to remember you're still alive." "I am alive!" she screamed, tears of fury and frustration burning her eyes. "Are you?" He was in front of her now, so close she had to crane her neck to look up at him. He reached out, his hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was firm but not painful. It was possessive. A current, hot and electric, shot through her at his touch. "You walk around this house like a ghost. You look at me like I'm your jailer. You cry for a dead man in your sleep. That ain't living. That's just waiting." "Let go of me," she whispered, but her body betrayed her. Instead of pulling away, she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender to the overwhelming force of his will, to the forbidden heat that was blooming in the pit of her stomach. His eyes searched hers, a battle raging within them. He saw her fear, her grief, her defiance, and he saw the flicker of desire she was trying so desperately to hide. His thumb moved, stroking the soft skin of her inner arm, sending shivers down her spine. "I can't," he rasped, his voice thick with a raw need that stunned them both. "God help me, Clara. I can't." He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She could see the decision in the hard set of his jaw, the darkening of his eyes. Her own lips parted in anticipation, her mind screaming betrayal while her body screamed for release. This was wild, reckless, a plunge into an abyss. This was the passion the original script had lacked, but then he flinched, as if burned. The ghost of his own past, of the woman in the locket, rose between them. He released her abruptly, stumbling back as if he'd touched fire. "The wolves don't ask questions before they eat," he said, the words harsh, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls between them. "You'd do well to remember that." He turned and fled the room, leaving Clara trembling, her arm tingling where he'd touched her, her heart a wild, chaotic storm. She hated him, she wanted him, and she was terrified that, in the end, those two feelings were one and the same. Part 4. Mine. A week later, the storm that had been brewing between them broke, and then he was gone. He left at dawn without a word, the slam of the front door echoing through the house like a gunshot. Clara told herself she was relieved. The tension, the constant, simmering heat between them had been unbearable. But the silence he left behind was worse. It was a hollow, aching void. The house, which had once felt like his fortress, now felt like her prison. She threw herself into her chores with a manic energy, scrubbing floors that were already clean, kneading bread with a fury that made her knuckles ache. "Damn you, Silas Boon," she muttered, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "You don't get to walk away. You don't get to light a fire and then run when it gets too hot." Her anger was a shield. Beneath it, a cold fear was beginning to seep in. This part of the country was unforgiving. Men disappeared. He had enemies. She'd seen it in the wary way he watched the horizon, the way he always kept a gun close. A sharp, metallic bang from the barn snapped her out of her thoughts. It was a sound that didn't belong, not the creak of wood or the sigh of the wind. Grabbing the rifle from its place by the door, she moved outside. Her hands were steady, her heart pounding a familiar rhythm of dread. The barn door swung open on a broken hinge, banging against the frame. "Silas?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the wind. She edged toward the barn, the mud sucking at her boots. Pushing the door fully open, she stepped inside, rifle raised. The barn was empty, filled with dancing shadows and the scent of hay and old blood. A scream built in her throat, but she choked it down. And then she saw it. Hanging from a nail on the wall was Silas's heavy duster, the one he always wore. It was stained, a dark, wet patch spreading across the back. Her blood ran cold. She ran forward, the world tilting. The coat was still damp. The blood was still warm. As she yanked it from the nail, a piece of folded paper, pinned to the collar, fluttered to the ground. She picked it up with trembling fingers. On it, scrawled in a crude hand with what looked horrifyingly like red ink, was a single, possessive word. Mine. This wasn't Silas's writing. This wasn't his blood. Or rather, it was his blood, but shed by another's hand. Before she could scream, a heavy arm snaked around her waist, yanking her back against a hard, foul-smelling chest. A calloused hand clamped over her mouth, and the cold, sharp edge of a knife pressed into the soft skin of her throat. Well, well, a low voice purred in her ear, the breath hot and stinking of whiskey. It was the voice from her nightmares, the voice of the settler who had robbed her. Looks like the widow's all alone again. Terror, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. But then, a white-hot rage surged through her veins, burning the fear to cinders. This was happening again. They had taken Thomas. They had taken her home. And now they had taken Silas. "Where is he?" she managed to gasp, her voice muffled by the hand. "What did you do to him?" The man chuckled, a vile, guttural sound. The blade bit into her skin, a tiny line of fire. "Don't you worry about your rich cowboy. The boss wants him to watch, wants him to see what a real man does with his property." He dragged her backward toward the barn door. "You belong to Talcott now, just a little wild rose plucked from the dirt for him to enjoy." The name, Talcott, hit her like a physical blow. The man who had sent them. The man who thought he owned her. She saw the shovel leaning against the wall, the same tool she'd used to bury her husband. She saw the rifle lying in the dirt just a few feet away. She wasn't that same woman. She wasn't nothing. Not anymore. The love she felt for Silas, a wild, fierce, protective thing she could no longer deny, had forged her grief and fear into a weapon. "You think I'm nothing?" she whispered, the words a promise. He snickered. "That's right. A dead man's..." "A rich man's burden. Nothing." She closed her eyes, took a breath, and drove her elbow back with all her might. She felt the crunch of his ribs, heard the grunt of pain. His grip loosened for a split second. It was all she needed. She dropped, spun, and her hand closed around the stock of the rifle. When she swung it around, the barrel was pressed flush against his forehead. The hunter had become the hunted. "I'm not nothing," she said, her voice dropping to that cold, venomous hiss. Her eyes were blazing. "I'm just getting started." Part 5. A ghost with a gun. The old mill stood like a skeleton against the bruised twilight sky, a place of rot and decay. Clara crouched behind a crumbling woodpile, the rifle a familiar weight in her hands. Her rage had cooled into a single, focused point of ice in her chest. Inside, she could hear them. 4 men, their laughter loud and ugly, echoing in the hollow structure. Peeking through a gap in the wall, she saw them. They were gathered around a fire burning in an old barrel, passing a bottle of whiskey. And then she saw him. Silas. He was slumped against a support beam, his hands bound, his head hanging low. Blood matted his dark hair from a gash on his forehead. Even from a distance, she could see the shallow, labored rise and fall of his chest. "You hear that, Boon?" one of the men sneered. It was the leader, a brutish man with a scarred face. "Your pretty little widow is on her way. Talcott wants her delivered fresh. Bet she puts up a fight." Another one chuckled, tossing a knife from hand to hand. "I like it when they fight." Silas's head lifted slowly. His eyes, when they found the man, were burning coals in his pale face. "You touch her," he rasped, his voice a low, deadly promise. "And I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you." The scarred man laughed and crouched in front of Silas, his face inches away. "You ain't killing no one, cowboy. Boss wants you alive. Wants you to have a front row seat when he breaks her. He pressed the flat of his knife against Silas's cheek. Think she'll scream your name? Or his? That was it. The ice in Clara's chest shattered, releasing a firestorm. Her breath slowed, her pulse steadied. The world narrowed to the front sight of her rifle. One shot, one man. She lined up the shot, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening. The man with the knife jerked, his head snapping back as a dark hole blossomed between his eyes. He collapsed without a sound. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then, chaos. The other three men scrambled, whipping around, eyes wide with shock and confusion. Clara stepped out from the shadows, a phantom of vengeance, the rifle already finding its next target. "You boys looking for me?" she asked, her voice calm and lethal. One of them, recovering first, lunged with a knife. He was clumsy, fueled by whiskey and surprise. Clara sidestepped, not with grace, but with brutal efficiency. She didn't fire. She swung the rifle like a club, the heavy wooden stock catching him under the jaw with a sickening crunch of bone. He crumpled. The third man had his gun out, but he was too slow. Clara dropped the rifle, and the hunting knife was in her hand, a fluid motion she hadn't known she possessed. She closed the distance in 2 strides, the blade a silver arc in the firelight. It slid into his throat, clean and deep. He fell to his knees, gurgling, his hands clutching at the wound as his life poured out into the dirt. The last man tackled her. He was big and strong, his weight driving her to the ground, knocking the wind from her lungs. His fist slammed into her jaw, and her head exploded with stars. "You stupid bitch," he snarled, his hands closing around her throat. Her vision tunneled, her lungs burned, her hands scrabbled desperately in the dirt, for a rock, a branch, anything. Her fingers brushed against something cold and heavy, the pistol the third man had dropped. Her hand closed around the grip. She didn't have time to aim. She pressed the barrel into his fleshy side and pulled the trigger. The explosion was muffled, the recoil jarring her arm. The man grunted, his body seizing. His grip on her throat slackened. He rolled off her, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Clara gasped for air, the world spinning. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying, and staggered towards Silas. "Silas," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her hands fumbling with the thick ropes on his wrists. "Silas, wake up." His eyelids fluttered. A low, pained groan escaped his lips. "Clara?" "Yeah," she sobbed, tears finally breaking free, streaming down her face and mixing with the dirt and blood. She sawed through the last rope with her knife. "I'm here. I'm right here." He slumped forward, his body a dead weight against hers. She held him, burying her face in his hair, inhaling his scent. Blood, sweat, and something that was just him. It was the most welcome smell in the world. "It's over," she whispered, rocking him gently. He stirred, his arms coming up to weakly encircle her waist, holding on as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. "Not yet," he breathed against her hair. "Talcott." "I know," she said, her voice hardening again. "He sent them to break you, to take me." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes fierce. "Now we go to break him." Part 6. Blood and Absolution. They stormed the Talcott Ranch under the cover of a rising, blood-red sun. There was no stealth now, only fury. Silas, leaning heavily on Clara, kicked open the front door. He was pale and losing blood, but his eyes were filled with a righteous fire, a knife clenched in his good hand. Clara held the rifle, its barrel still warm. Talcott was sitting in a large armchair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smug smile on his face. He looked up, and his smile faltered, replaced by disbelief. "Well, well," he drawled, recovering quickly. "Look what the storm blew in. I must say, I'm disappointed in my men." "They're dead," Clara said, her voice flat. She leveled the rifle at his chest. "And you," Silas snarled, taking a staggering step forward, "are next." Talcott laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "You can barely stand, Boon. And her?" He sneered at Clara. "You took my husband," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You took my home. You sent your animals to take my life and my soul." "Your husband was a weak fool who owed me money," Talcott said, his eyes glinting. "And as for you, my dear, you were part of the payment." He took a sip of whiskey. "I was looking forward to collecting." This was it. The moment she'd lived for. But it wasn't just about revenge for Thomas anymore. It was for the man standing beside her, bleeding for her. It was for the savage, beautiful, terrifying love that had grown between them in the silence and the storms. It was for them. Before Clara could pull the trigger, Silas lunged. It was a primal roar of a man pushed beyond his limits. He crashed into Talcott, sending the chair skittering backward. The whiskey glass shattered. They fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs, Silas's knife flashing. Talcott was bigger, healthier, but Silas fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Clara watched, frozen for a second, as they wrestled on the floor. Talcott landed a punch, and Silas grunted, but he didn't let go. He was a wolf, with his jaws locked on his enemy. Clara saw Talcott's hand scrabbling for the fireplace poker. "No!" she screamed. She didn't think. She acted. She brought the butt of her rifle down hard on the back of Talcott's head. He went limp for a moment, and in that moment, it was over. Silas rose, his chest heaving, his knife crimson. Talcott lay still on the floor, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breaths. Silas turned to her, his face a mask of pain, exhaustion, and something else. Something fierce and tender. He swayed on his feet. "Clara!" Her knees gave out, and she fell into him, her arms wrapping around his neck. The sobs she had held back for so long finally came, racking her body. It was a storm of grief, relief, terror, and a love so powerful it hurt. "I thought I lost you," she choked out, her fingers digging into his hair. He held her tight, his face buried in her neck, his own body trembling. "You'll never lose me," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Not ever." He pulled back, his bloody hands cupping her face. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a widow, not as a bargain, but as the woman who had walked through fire for him. "I love you, Clara," he said, the words raw and torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I love you," she sobbed, the words a confession and a release. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, hungry, claiming kiss. It was a fusion of two broken souls forged into one in the crucible of violence and survival. It was the taste of blood, tears, and absolution. It was wild. It was passionate. It was the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come, earned in the darkest of nights. They were not haunted anymore. They were free. In the unforgiving heart of the Wild West, survival was a victory, and love was a miracle. The story of Clara Evans and Silas Boon is not just a tale of revenge, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They were two ghosts, haunted by the past, who found in each other a reason to live again. Their love wasn't born in quiet parlors with soft words, but forged in blood, fear, and the savage beauty of a shared will to fight. They discovered that the deepest wounds can be healed, not by forgetting, but by finding someone who is willing to stand with you in the storm and fight the demons by your side. Theirs is a story that proves that even from the ashes of tragedy, the most wild and passionate love can bloom. If the tale of Clara and Silas moved you, please show your support for our channel. Subscribe to Wild West Stories, like this video, and share it with others who appreciate stories of grit, survival, and untamed love.